What's in Your First Aid Kit series. I'm Eukarya Borden, Senior Director of Health Equity at the Cancer Support Community. We are a global nonprofit network of 175 locations, including Cancer Support Community and Gilda's Club partners, hospital and clinic partnerships that deliver more than $50 million in free support and navigation services to patients and families. We administer a toll-free helpline and produce award-winning educational and digital resources that reach more than 1 million people each year. We also conduct cutting-edge research on the emotional, psychological, and financial journey of cancer patients and advocates at all levels of government for policies to help individuals whose lives have been disrupted by cancer. Our belief that community is stronger than cancer is what led us to create this workshop series for oncology professionals. We recognize that you, the cancer care community, are on the front lines of care. The care you provide impacts cancer patients, survivors, and caregivers from the moment of diagnosis and through the end of life. We thank you for your commitment, your passion, and for your compassionate expertise. Dr. Athena Baca-Chieza is a clinical health psychologist in Denver, Colorado. She received her doctorate in clinical psychology from the Chicago School of Professional Psychology in 2006. She completed a health psychology residency at Brooke Army Medical Center in San Antonio, Texas, with an emphasis in oncology and women's health. She went on to complete a postdoctoral fellowship in oncology and bone marrow transplant at the University of Colorado Health Sciences Center in 2006. Dr. Baca-Chieza is currently an associate professor at the University of Colorado, Denver, where she is the coordinator of clinical training and director of a community mental health clinic in the CU Denver Clinical Health Psychology PhD program. In addition to her current position at CU, Dr. Baca-Chieza also works as a consulting psychologist in the Hem/Onc and bone marrow transplant program at University of Colorado Hospital, where she supports patients who are navigating the complex biopsychosocial intersections of living with blood cancers and conducts pre-transplant evaluations. Dr. Baca-Chieza is actively involved in leadership and advocacy for her profession and has served on the board of the Colorado Psychological Association, or CPA, since 2015, when she was elected as the state's diversity representative. Dr. Baca-Chieza proudly hails from the beautiful border town of El Paso, Texas, is fluently bilingual in Spanish, and identifies as Afro-Latina, Mexican, and Black. She currently resides in Denver with her spouse and 2 daughters. Welcome, Athena.
Hi, thank you. Can you all hear me? I'm a little nervous, and so I become somewhat of a Luddite. I'm already one, but I definitely get nervous, and so become technologically challenged under circumstances like these. And I really struggle in these situations because I do better, I think most of us probably do, face to face. And so the fact that I can't see your faces and don't know where most of you all are coming in from and dialing in from is tough for me. But I really hope that I'm able to connect with you today and that you enjoy this conversation and learn something new. And more than anything, that as we're talking, I'm able to create a space that feels safe to not only explore the topics that we're talking about, that you feel safe to share with vulnerability if we have time. I'll be asking some questions throughout this conversation. And so I hope that as you're hearing my voice and seeing my face, that you see that I, with genuine sincerity and authenticity, welcome your voices and your ideas and for you to share. And so I'm excited to be here today. And so I'll be talking today about this idea of racial caucuses and affinity groups, and hoping that you will understand how when we share in spaces such as these, which I'll get into more detail about what they are, they create space where minoritized individuals And our white coworkers can work intentionally to cultivate psychological safety at work. So just in full disclosure, I have no financial relationships or affiliations. And our goals for today, I hope that we can get through all of these. I will be summarizing the concept of burnout and how people of color in healthcare settings are at higher risk of burnout. I'll describe the term psychological safety and how employers should really consider the unique needs of people of color in work settings. And I'll describe how these affinity groups and racial caucuses, and I'll use these two words interchangeably, or these two concepts interchangeably. They'll increase psychological safety for people of color at work and decrease burnout. So I want to start off with a reflection, if you'll allow me this moment. It's December 26th, 2021. That's just a few weeks ago, the day after one of the most celebrated holidays of the year. My husband and 2 daughters are positive for the COVID virus, which forced us to cancel our travel plans last minute to be with our family, who we haven't been able to celebrate with since 2018. Like millions of people around the world, we're isolated, feeling lonely and sad and frustrated because we thought we'd done everything right. I had just had COVID over Thanksgiving and had to quarantine, missing another season for celebrating family and for rest. My husband is a bedside nurse on the night shift who has been working tirelessly to care for his patients, to support his colleagues, and to remain engaged in the face of his own burnout. I'm a health psychologist, a university professor, and a clinician in oncology and bone marrow transplant. We're both active in our careers. We have busy social calendars and are very involved parents to our 2 young daughters. Our cultural and ethnic identities are central to who we are. My partner is Black. He's an immigrant from Zimbabwe, raised in Central Texas. And I'm Afro-Latina, a first-generation Mexican-American. I was born and raised in a border town. We're doing our best, but we're tired and we're not alone. But as people of color, and especially at work, we often feel alone. So this presentation will explore psychological safety at work, the risk for burnout when safety is not established, and how people of color are at greater risk for professional burnout when they do not feel safe, and how efforts such as racial caucuses might contribute towards culturally responsive psychological safety for all employees. So I'll start off with my first poll question, which is, have you ever heard of or participated in a racial caucus or affinity group? And I'll just give you a second to answer that question for me.
Hi, Athena, it's Tara. Can you see those results coming in?
I just see the question box there on the screen.
Well, I will keep you updated. So we have about 80% of folks who've participated. So we'll give it another minute and then show the results.
All right, so it says, oh gosh, so 21% of you have heard of these groups and opportunities, 64% had not. And so similar to you, prior to just a few months ago when I learned about these groups, I too had not heard about these. We're running them as a pilot program with the training consortium that I'm a part of. And so I too am just new to this concept, and 15% of you are not sure. And so maybe you're like, I think I have. And so say more, and then I'll let you know. So thank you for participating in this. And we'll get into this a little bit more. I keep forgetting that I have to. So what is psychological safety? So the term psychological safety was, and maybe by now most of us have heard about this in one way or another, but Amy Edmonson over at Harvard coined this term, and it refers to teams that can put themselves out there, ask questions, make mistakes, learn from these mistakes, and know that it's okay. They feel safe with each other as groups, both as in smaller groups, larger groups, with their superiors, with the hierarchies. And the psychological safety that is established within teams encourages diverse thinking. It allows teammates to learn and become their full contributing selves, even if there are clear power differentials. every person on a team knows that what they bring to the table and to the team is important, and that their unique skills and abilities are valued, that their voices are important, even when they're saying things that are contrary, even when they say things that are different, that they are valued and important. And people on teams with psychological safety feel as if their skills and talents are really important and valued, and they enjoy mutual respect and trust. And that trust thing is really important to keep in mind and to keep central. Again, I think about healthcare settings because of that inherent hierarchy that exists, that is just sort of born and innate in healthcare. When there's psychological safety, it does not necessarily matter who's in charge, because everybody is important and a contributing team member, and that is so key. So I want to take a look at this clip. I don't know if any of you watch Ted Lasso. My husband is obsessed with soccer, and we watch soccer in any form, including in its Hollywood versions. And so we're big Ted Lasso fans. And I want to take a look at this clip, and I want you to ask the question as you're watching this clip. How does Ted Lasso create psychological safety? And if you can kind of just put some answers into the chat for me as you're watching, we'll take a look and see. Okay, so unfortunately, I wanted to show more of this clip, but there is a lot of really inappropriate language and curse words that I don't get offended by, but I don't know how many people actually ended up logging on, and I would not want to offend people. So I'm going to stop the clip there and just try to get a sense of, Susan, can I open my chat and read some of the answers, or how should I do that?
You sure can. You can open your chat. We can.
Sure, thanks. So Ted made space for Nate to speak in his own words versus presenting for him. Thanks, Kathy. He appears to have listened. He accepted responsibility and empowered his colleague. Noah says he listened and apologized. Let's see. He supports Nate's ideas, lays the groundwork for others to hear, and then let the ideas come directly from Nate. Ted gave good eye contact and verbal cues showing support in addition to what he said. Elena says, Ted treats Nate like an equal, which I really appreciate, because I don't know if you watched the show, but Nate actually just started as someone in like the towel room, or he was not initially in the hierarchy of professional soccer. He was certainly not someone who would be speaking to the team as a coach. Sarah says he's assuming the best in everyone. He acknowledges what he did wrong and apologizes. I really appreciate that point, because I think that when leaders can apologize and model that they've done something wrong, own what they've done, no matter who someone is on a team, acknowledge that and apologize and provide a leadership opportunity. Anita says this, and yes, that's so big, to provide leadership and elevate other people and give other people an opportunity to shine, I think is so, so important. I think that all of you, those of you who have spoken up in the chat, thank you so much for helping me with this. I think you really highlighted what I love so much about this clip. And then for me, as a person of color, and my husband as well, what we're always looking out for is representation. And so in just this short clip, there was an opportunity for not only someone who on the hierarchy of this, football club, someone who is, in the background and the towel boy gets elevated, but also someone who's a person of color. And then within the team, there are also often representations of people from different backgrounds, different cultures, different languages that get celebrated. So we in our family really appreciate that this show celebrates that. So jumping back in. Psychological safety in healthcare environments. So healthcare is a high stress environment. We know this. I'm making assumptions that most of us in this audience are in healthcare or have access to healthcare or in close proximity to healthcare. And we know that it's a high stress environment where adverse outcomes happen on a daily basis and workers feel intense pressure to make minimal mistakes. We know mistakes in healthcare can have catastrophic outcomes, if not for the patient, for the team. Research has identified the clear link between a provider's mental health and healthcare outcomes, including patient safety, with the probability of contributing to a preventable incident increasing when the provider is suffering from psychological distress. So when the providers are when their mental health is not well, when the team's mental health is not well, the research indicates that there are adverse outcomes. For example, a healthcare professional may feel emotionally traumatized after a sudden or unexpected bad outcome, a patient safety incident, the loss of a patient with whom they feel close, workplace conflict, dealing with multiple trauma cases. I've worked in oncology for getting close to 20 years and working with my medical colleagues and seeing the way that they bond and connect with patients and families and how those relationships directly impact their mental health. It really starts to take a toll on their ability to stay present and stay focused. And yet they don't always necessarily have the time to process these emotions, process those losses. And then I've been on teams where there is also, in addition to all that is taking place on these teams and on these units, also not psychological safety present. And so even if there are team members who want to process these feelings and emotions, there is not a sense that if they were to come forward with these feelings, there is not safety to do so. And so what is happening with all of this? What is happening with all of these thoughts and feelings? Where is it going? What behaviors are being modeled to each other? When young staff comes in, how are older staff members modeling how you process all of this? And what is the culture that is being established in healthcare environments that is either contributing to healthy spaces or unhealthy spaces? So I want to tell a story that reflects this, that I'm calling Caring for Mrs. Smith, but it's a story that's very personal. I've mentioned that my husband's a nurse. He works the night shift. He's actually asleep downstairs because he's getting ready to go to work, but he comes home and he tells me stories. He and I have worked side by side for many years, oftentimes on the same unit. Susan Ashley can vouch for this. We all worked on the same oncology unit many years ago. And he came home and he told this story about Mrs. Smith. My husband's name is Cheeto. He was recently caring for Mrs. Smith. Mrs. Smith is a Black, late 80-year-old woman who's been in treatment for cancer and has severe GI disease. She's doing poorly and has been hospitalized for many weeks. She's still currently on the unit. And Cheeto noticed immediately that his colleagues communicate differently with her. When they enter her room, they say things like, "Hey, girl," and "Hey, Miss Fang," and they change their accents to a Southern drawl. Yet he noticed that they don't do the same thing when they're caring for their white patients of the same age or background. And while this bothered him, he didn't say anything at first. He would just angrily internalize his frustrations and make sure he made extra efforts to show Mrs. Smith respect and deference in his interactions when he went in with her. However, he eventually felt compelled to say something. He confronted the group in the bullpen and shared in a really general way what he'd been noticing. And he mentioned, "I've noticed that when you all are going in, or when people are going in to talk to Mrs. Smith, they talk to her in this way and they use this accent and they say these things. And it bothers me and I feel badly for her and her family that they're witnessing this. And I just wonder why we do this when we talk to Mrs. Smith." And he just left it. And they started to get very pensive. And throughout the night, he said that his peers and colleagues started to just come up to him and first thank him for saying something, but then and my husband and I talk about how this happens when we do feel courageous enough to finally say something. They started to make confessions or apologize. Some of them were very grateful, but they started to process their feelings and just process that experience. And I realized that when Cheeto did this, it put an additional burden on him. Not only was it painful for Cheeto to observe a fellow Black person being disrespected with these microaggressions, contributing to his own trauma, which he carries when he goes into work, but it put him in a position to have to teach his white peers and colleagues how their behavior was inappropriate, disrespectful, and potentially even harmful to Mrs. Smith. And this is just one example of how this one Black nurse individual, in this case, my husband, has to serve in his already really stressful job as a nurse, but he's also having to serve as an advocate, as a voice for social justice and racial equity, putting himself in a vulnerable position with his colleagues and peers by bringing up his observations. And all of these things contribute to burnout. So nurses already being at risk for burnout. So all nurses are at risk for burnout, especially now. We know healthcare providers are being stretched and pulled and pushed to the nth degree. This pandemic has really elucidated in incredible gaps in our healthcare system and in our ability as human beings to just give compassion for this length of time for 2 years straight. But then on top of this, to also have to carry these burdens that I demonstrate in this example, I just have been noticing I'm very closely related to someone who really carries additional responsibilities and burdens and internalizes them. He happens to be a very sensitive person, but I feel like even if you aren't someone who wears their heart on a sleeve, to go in and out of your system day in and day out and be bearing witness to situations like this, it's inevitable that it starts to sort of tear away at your ability to continue to provide compassionate care without it sort of impacting you and bringing you down. So I'm sorry, I have to keep moving my little tile so that I can see the title of my screen. So psychological safety for people of color, with that example in mind, while these are incredibly stressful times for many Americans, they're especially stressful for BIPOC. So BIPOC, to remind you all, is Black, Indigenous people of color. So I use that acronym. So our BIPOC employees or employees of BIPOC families who see representations of themselves being brutally impacted by racism daily on the news, on social media, in Hollywood representations, were inundated by the stress of what it means to be a BIPOC individual. To be a person of color means to experience discrimination regularly. If you're Black, that experience is often daily being feared for simply being. The objectification of difference, such as the texture of your hair, people who use performative Blackness, such as a Black scent, the example that I just gave of how people were talking to Mrs. Smith when they're relating to you, people not even doing it consciously, just subconsciously slipping into these strange personifications of what they perceive Blackness to be. But these microaggressions have impact and they hurt and they're harmful. So microaggressions and psychological safety take a toll. They are not only occurring in our day-to-day informal lives, but they're happening at work. And so I just want us to be thinking about that, not only during this talk, but just when we go back to our work lives. If you're working with BIPOC individuals, I want you to consider the ways that we might contribute, might be, enacting microaggressions, but how those microaggressions hurt our coworkers. And I use humor. I think humor is important. to have difficult conversations, but it's not funny the way that it takes a deep toll. So let's listen to how Trevor Noah talks about this, and then we'll process that again a little.
In the office, you better check yourself before you wreck yourself. Now,
Oopsie.
if you're one of the few.
So, let's see here. So, yeah, so I think just, again, poignant thoughts about how people have to shift the way that they present in work environments. I really appreciated that clip from Trevor Noah, and more than that, the thoughts that the people who contributed to his video really just bring to mind about how much work Black and Brown people have to do when they're going to work, because they're carrying the burden of stereotype, of the pressure to perform. So how do we create these safe spaces? So too often people do not speak up at work because they don't feel that it's safe. They might feel ashamed to ask a question. They might fear the consequences of pointing out a potential issue. So I think about that example with Mrs. Smith with Cheeto, and what it took for him, or the many examples that what might come to mind, of what it might take to bring something up that you disagree with. And does it feel safe? And will people consider me like, oh, now am I going to be, and insert stereotype here, I'm going to be perceived as the angry Black woman, or are people going to perceive me as pulling the race card, or am I going to be seen as someone who's too sensitive? Or there's a laundry list of reasons that Black and Brown people might not raise their voice and bring up potential issues because the consequences are so grave. And so oftentimes these microaggressions and these situations are allowed to slip and slip and slip and slip by. But they chip away and they chip away and they chip away, and they cause harm and they cause damage. So in creating psychological safety at work, people of color also need their own spaces free from marginalization, free from mainstream stereotypes and the pressures to perform the way that these groups of people were talking about that performance, free from the pressures to code switch and speak these multiple languages in settings where often just white Western dominance is inevitable. It's the norm. It's the way and the basis and the foundation for which and by which all of these settings where we work, it's the foundation. It's the culture that we, our standards are set. I'm going to open the chat for a second. I just want to make sure that I'm not missing anything. Yeah, so people are just making comments about how it is exhausting to live in this way and to not. And I really appreciate what Trevor Noah said about how white people don't have to think about these things. They don't have to consider what it's like to carry these additional burdens, to code switch, to carry these stereotypes, to switch back and forth. There were so many clips I wanted to share, and I wish I had the time to be able to do so, because so many of these stories were just so powerful. And my partner was watching me work on this over these past couple of months and hearing me in the background. He was like, oh, that was so good. Oh, I wish you could share that. Oh my gosh, that's such a good point. And so I wonder if I should almost later share some of the places that I found these clips to hear these Black and Brown voices and what it's like to just go into work, and the amount of work to go into work is the only thing that comes to mind for me. And the time and the energy that it takes to just take that deep breath and know that you're going to have to just do this code switching and do this performing so that you're accepted and understood, that so many people don't have to do when they go into work. So another poll question, and I'm curious about this one because part of why I have been so nervous about this talk is I was nervous about just how the idea of racial caucusing might make people feel. I wanted to know if the idea of racial caucusing makes you feel uncomfortable. I feel like the language is laden In particular, now there's so much controversy and so much pushback on what we should be learning, what we should be unpacking. People are taking issue with our symbolism, our language, taking concepts like critical race theory out of our schools, really, pushing back on, what we're teaching our children. I think that there's just a lot of fear and uncertainty. And racism, as we know, is alive and well in our world, not just our country. I just had a conversation last night with a woman from Mexico who was just lamenting how in Mexico, this is just so racism is so prevalent, and colorism and classism. And I know people from all over the world who struggle with similar concepts and issues. In the United States, we just handle it in different ways, in ways that I find to be just challenging in our own ways. And so I just was curious to know if this was something that made people feel uncomfortable. I also was just really aware of how I live in a lot of bubbles that are really protective. And sometimes those bubbles, while they protect me, feel really jarring when I leave the bubble, because sometimes the safety of my bubble makes me think that everyone that I surround myself and my family with think like me. And then I leave the bubble and it's like, oh, wait, not everyone thinks like me. And so recognizing that there is a bubble in this professional space that I'm in. I'm often surrounded by people who share my values, who share my professional values. And so I'm recognizing and making some assumptions that I might be preaching to the choir a bit in working with cancer professionals and working with healthcare professionals who, by and large, share a lot of the a lot of the personal values that I share, but also wanting to acknowledge that there's vulnerability and that not all of us are on the same journey in unpacking our racism and our prejudices and our ignorance that all of us have. I don't care who you are or where you come from. We all have things to unpack and we all have things to learn and unlearn. And so I just wanted to create space to acknowledge that not all of us are comfortable with these concepts and ideas. And so it looks like 13% of us feel really uncomfortable with this concept. And that makes sense to me, and that's okay. And I'm hoping that through talking a little bit more about this, 50% of us aren't uncomfortable and 37% aren't sure. And that makes good sense to me. And I wanted to, just learn a little bit more about what these caucuses and affinity groups endeavor to do and why I personally feel like these spaces can be important, and why the people who started to create these spaces feel they're important. And I hope that by the end, there continues to be conversations about why unique spaces can be so important for white people and for people of color to have these conversations. So what is a caucus, a racial caucus? So the definition of caucus means means counselor, and caucuses provide spaces for people to work within their own racial and ethnic groups. So in anti-racism organizing, racial identity caucuses are common where people of color and white people meet separately for a time to counsel together. And this is a tool, not a goal. The focus is for people of color caucuses often confront the impact of internalized racist oppression, and white people generally focus on issues of internalized superiority. So people of color caucuses often confront the impact of internalized racist oppression. They collectively are discovering new behaviors and thought processes that are liberating and which heal internalized racist oppression. They're giving one another permission to identify and redirect negative and destructive behaviors. They're putting individual people back together and restoring the community when there's devastating effects of internalized racial oppression. And so I wanted to share this reflection of an attendant, of someone who attended one of these caucuses that was particularly and specifically for people of color. In these spaces, we can share stories about discrimination we faced and find understanding and support. We can define ourselves on our own terms. When white people are present, this crucial examining usually doesn't happen. Sharing our experiences in integrated spaces often means preparing to defend our anger and frustration, or taking care of white individuals who find what is being said hurtful. This means that when people of color do take the leap to share painful experiences, white listeners often shift the focus back onto themselves and their own grievances. Thus, attention and power implicitly shift back to white individuals, reinforcing the status quo. There can also arise a need to translate our experiences into terms that white listeners will be more sympathetic to in order to be heard. Genuine allyship requires genuine listening, especially when that listening is hard to be with. So, why White Folks Caucus is that it's a safe setting where you can risk being honest with other white people regarding your own racialization and a desire to become anti-racist. It's supporting and sustaining one another while looking at difficult stuff. It's standing together in a new way and clarifying where you're at and what's lacking and what you're doing well. It's owning and holding one another and clarifying accountable ways to use each other's gifts. It's deepening your commitments to one another, the team, and ultimately the anti-racism movement, being clear about racism's power in and over you as individuals and as a collective. It's more effectively doing the collective work of the team and thus more effectively dismantling racism in society, gaining a sense of what is possible in forging an anti-racist white identity, and returning to the overall collective better equipped to take up the task of building an anti-racist community. So I think this is our final poll question, which is, so if we're having people of color caucuses over here and we're having white caucuses over here, do you think that these groups might contribute to segregation? And can I move to the next slide while we're answering these questions?
Sure, go ahead. It should still say up.
Okay. So is this segregation and do they promote separation? So for white people, they provide space and time to work explicitly and intentionally on understanding white culture, white privilege, and to increase one's critical analysis around these concepts. A white caucus also puts the onus on white people to teach each other about these ideas, rather than placing the burden on people of color to teach them. And for people of color, the caucus is a place to work with peers to address the impact of racism, to interrupt these experiences of internalized racism. Yeah. Thank you all for participating. I appreciate these answers. These numbers are interesting. Yeah. It interrupts these experiences of internalized racism and to create space for healing and working for individual and collective liberation. And again, when these groups are separated, the burden is not on each other group to apologize, to teach, to support, to say thank you, but instead to do the own work. And those burdens are cleared up so that you can just attend to whatever heaviness is there to be attended to, whatever is there for each group to learn from, to grow from, and the energy is there and is available to be able to do that important work. So I want to listen to this next clip, and then we'll process this next question. I went into work the day after the murder of yet another Black person with a mix of emotions that I expected everyone would feel. What happened hurt much more. At work the next day, aside from BIPOC at work, no one mentioned a thing. One of my many coworkers didn't seem to care about what happened, and leadership already decided to remain silent on the issue. I negotiated, argued, advocated for resources to do something. They did not agree. I left that organization a few months later. A few years later, in a different organization, another murder occurred of a young Black man at the hands of the police. The reaction of this executive leadership was different. They consulted with our office and formulated a well-thought-out statement to employees about their support during this affront on social justice. They also pledged financial support to help our office put together facilitated conversations on the issue. Almost the opposite of my last experience. My office brought in consultants, EAP, our training department, and our ERG leaders. And after a few weeks, we put together a series of facilitated discussions on race. Our survey of employees was overwhelmingly supportive, but upon closer look at the post-discussion evaluations, BIPOC employees were not. I started receiving requests for meetings from BIPOC employees who had participated because they were upset about the experience. They experienced the following: micro-dismissive comments from white participants, lack of psychological safety of speaking because they were in the minority, feeling vulnerable speaking in groups that included members of management, feeling pressure and expectation to represent all BIPOC, defensiveness in reaction to hearing BIPOC experiences, dismissal of policing being a social justice issue, frustration with white participants sharing their historical experience as comparable to the experience of BIPOC people, double standards as some employees showed solidarity in the discussion, but later spoke differently amongst coworkers. The discussion centered white comfort. White people felt good about themselves, proud of the organization, and felt as though the race issue was resolved within the organization. Many BIPOC employees felt frustrated and disappointed with the whole experience. So I was really interested in that narrative and that reflection, because the question that came up was, are these workplace reactions and responses and discussions on race really designed to positively impact BIPOC employees, or are they centered around helping white employees live with the discomfort of racism? And so again, thinking about when workplace environments try to respond in kind, in support, are they really centering the support of the people they're trying to support? And so that was what I thought and think is most important about this reflection, and why the separation of and the creation of space for people to truly feel safe and have that psychological safety, and those true safe spaces becomes critical. So I want to make sure I show you what does an affinity group look like? What do these caucuses look like? What does a curriculum actually look like? And so I've linked these resources for you all because they are incredibly helpful, can actually, and will walk you through exactly what takes place if you were to want to start these in your own workplaces or start to have conversations about what this would look like. Because these are vulnerable conversations and not something you would just want to jump into. You would want to be really thoughtful and caring and intentional about what this would look like. But this is an example of an affinity group that walks you through point by point, session by session, from session one, all the way from what a facilitator would be keeping in mind, how you would create the space, how you would start with introductions, setting the groundwork. You know, Susan Ashley taught me almost 20 years ago how crucial it is to set the culture for doing groups. But to conduct an affinity group where you would be talking about such vulnerable, such important work like race, in particular with coworkers, could really be, it could go beautifully or it could cause irreversible damage. So you would want to make sure that whoever is going to be facilitating these conversations, that they have the knowledge, the foundation, the understanding, the support, the background, the scaffolding, that you know exactly what you're doing, you know who you're inviting, you understand the language that you're going to use, that you are going to model safety, that you are not just going to jump into this willy-nilly and hurt people and harm relationships, and then have to jump back in and go into word processing or whatever it is that the organization does. But instead, that this is so done with such intention and love and care so that the safety is created. And so what I love about these curricula is that they really acknowledge that this is not easy. The links that I've shared with you start with the assumption that not all organizations are ready to move to a group, and instead maybe need to start with conversations like, what is racism? What is privilege? So they start from the very beginning of what these conversations are. And so that by the time you get to a group like this, you've done an incredible amount of work. So I also want to say that and share that I would never assume that to get to a place in your organization that you're having an affinity group, you have not done an incredible amount of pre-work. But this assumes that the pre-work has been done, safety has been established, people have self-identified and self-selected to want to do this work. And so that you establish who is there, what is the overview of the process. Really important guidelines have been set for how you have conversations. You're respectful, you share airtime. You then explore identity. So what is identity? What is your racial and ethnic identity? How do you respect each other as you explore these things? And then what I love about this is that while it is careful not to make broad assumptions and stereotypes, it allows for what certain groups might hold as important. So if you're working with African Americans, topics that they might hold as important to discuss. Or if you're working with Asian Americans or the Latinx community or recent immigrants, it gives you topics of conversation that can help guide these affinity groups. So how do we name ourselves? What are intergroup conflicts? Bilingual education, abuse in our community, affirmative action. So it gives topic areas to discuss that might be helpful to lead conversations, but again, not necessarily to stereotype or to give broad generalizations, but instead to provide cues. And this is just one example of a curriculum that I really, really like. Let me go back to this. And then a white caucus format that I really love. I mentioned earlier that I'm part of a pilot program, and this is an example of what the white caucus group did and used. They had an article that they all participated and read prior to meeting. This was just in December. My really good friend, Jenna Glover, facilitated this group. Because it's a pilot, they're also doing pre and post survey information. Because we're in Colorado and on Native lands, we're often acknowledging and trying to make reparations with our Native community. And so they started off with reading this land acknowledgement, but then they went through the white caucusing guidelines, which was really important. This is new. So a lot of us are just not sure, like, what does this look like? Are we safe? Am I going to be judged? What if I say the wrong thing? I'm really terrified to insult my colleagues and coworkers. So really trying to create safety for people to participate. And then they read the article as a group prior to this, why my good intentions aren't good enough to dismantle white superiority. So there's a list of articles that you could read together as a group. And then they processed it together in this first group, and then we'll continue doing the work together over the next few months. So this is an example of the curriculum for the White Caucus. Here are some more examples that I've linked in this final excellent. I mean, every single thing that I've talked about today has been informed by this website called Racial Equity Tools. I cannot say enough about it because this is the website that I told you starts with even just the fundamentals of how to have some of these conversations that can feel really, really overwhelming, really, really threatening. And there's a lot of fear that people feel when they have these conversations. So I encourage you to go to this website if you can, Racial Equity Tools, if you're interested in starting to have these conversations. And so the final question, there was one more. Knowing what you know with just this information that I've been able to share, might you participate in a racial caucus if your workplace offered the opportunity? And as you're answering that, I do come to the end of my conversation, and I'm just so grateful. I would love to have a couple of minutes to ask questions. I'm so grateful for your time, and want to just end as I kind of close up with some images that are really important to me and my family, from a border town, and love my hometown. And so this is just a mural that popped up after the shooting in my hometown recently, the mass shooting. And so this is Ánimo Sin Fronteras. It's a mural in El Paso, and my husband is from Zimbabwe. And this is a sculpture here in Colorado of a Zimbabwean sculpture called Me Too Mama. And I wanted to share that with you. And this is, oh, awesome. Oh, wow. This is amazing. I'm actually really surprised to see the results of this poll. That's really great that you all would participate in this. That's great. That makes me really happy. Thank you. And then this is my family, my partner, Cheeto, and my daughters, my youngest daughter here, Juno, and my older daughter, Raphael. We call her Rafi. So what questions do you have? I'm just going to start. Yes. So I'll make sure. There it is. Thank you, Susan. That's the resource list. It's incredible. I am not an expert in this. I am just learning myself. I feel so lucky that I've just learned about these tools. I think they're incredible and amazing. And I'm so happy to share them with you. I wish that we had more time. What other thoughts or questions do you have for me?
Athena, there was a question a little bit back, and I want to make sure it gets answered. So someone had asked, do you have research to support the success of white caucuses in accomplishing the goals defined?
Yeah, so this came out of actually, so the reason that we're running this pilot program and the way that we know about it is that the CU School of Medicine here in Denver started doing this work for their Black and Brown residents who are so Colorado is not a very ethnically diverse state. While we do have large refugee communities, by and large, and as it compares to other states, in particular on the East Coast and such, it's not super, super ethnically diverse. And so when we have people coming in from other parts of the world, a lot of these trainees, in particular medical trainees, were really feeling isolated and just not really feeling understood. And so some of the medical leadership started doing work around these caucuses and have really started to show great success for their medical trainees. And so if you start to dive into the research, there is a lot of work being done showing relevancy for creating separate spaces for people to be able to process these emotions in order to create psychological safety. So yes, there is evidence showing that the more work that we do, and I actually even also have some information based on just our pilot program and what our trainees who have participated in it and also the faculty who've participated in it are very grateful and feeling like it's such an acknowledgement of the experiences that they've had, oftentimes feeling like they have just been suffering in silence, and just in creating these spaces has felt like such an acknowledgement of their experience of having felt alone, having felt like an only one, like an other, and that to have these opportunities, all of a sudden it felt like they were seen, that their experiences mattered, even if it was just like 2 or 3 people in the People of Color Caucus. It was just like an opportunity for them to be listened to safely without having to also answer questions and explain and teach. And so that is very, very powerful for people.
Great. That actually leads us into one of the next questions.
Mm-hmm.
From Gilda's Club Chicago. They asked, is it harder to do this with small organizations, which as a result would have smaller groups?
I would imagine so. Yeah, I would imagine so. But I also wonder, like with larger national syndicates, and especially with what pandemic has taught us, if using our creativity allows us to maybe, spread our reach a little bit more. So like with Gilda's Club, maybe there's a Gilda's Club Chicago, which is small, but with Gilda's Club being larger, could there be the ability to connect Gilda's clubs on a national level and see if there's a way to use, although I would love the intimacy of face-to-face. I also think we've had to figure out how to just make the best of our situations and circumstances. So being here in Denver, and my husband and I talk all the time about we're literally almost always the only people of color in a group. I'm going to take any opportunity that I can. So if that means having to work remotely, I would do that versus just not doing it at all, or the other alternative being one or two people, so I think that we also have to be open to being creative if we happen to be in an organization that's small or in a part of the country that just doesn't have a lot of opportunities.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Athena. So we are at time for the end of our program, but I just wanted to say thank you again so much for being here. And thank you to everyone who's able to join us. Just logistically speaking, we will be sending out a PDF of Dr. Baca-Chieza's presentation. So you'll receive that in an email. And again, please make sure, we definitely want to hear your feedback. There is an evaluation link that has been put in the chat, and you'll also receive a little pop-up when you exit the webinar. So please be sure to fill out an evaluation as well.
Yes, thank you. And I'm also happy if you want to share my email with the group and people want to email directly, I'd be so happy to answer questions.
Wonderful. And I know there were a couple of resources that were shared, so I'll make sure, we're in touch to get all those for the folks that joined as well.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
Bye, everyone.